Okay, so now let me talk about how you're going to run these moderation analyses in Stata and SPSS. So first I'll tell you about the group scatter plots. In SPSS, we're going to use Chart Builder like we've been doing for our charts. So this is already set up, but let me reset it for you. Here's where the group scatter plot is. It's in the scatter plot section. And you just double click on that. It's going to have 3 boxes for you that you really want. First, we're going to put our dependent variable, stir craziness. Our independent variable is days in isolation. And what I did is I changed that to a, to make sure SPSS knows that it's a continuous variable. It's going to help us with our fit line later. And then our categorical moderator is extroversion, and we're going to throw that over here. So that's going to be the different colors on the graph. So you've already seen this graph, but here it is again. And if we double click on it, what we can do is we can get some fit lines. So when we've been looking at SPSS before, what we'll do is we'll add a fit line at the total. And so that's a fit line for the entire sample. So that's everybody, right? But that doesn't really help us to answer this moderation question because it's like everybody grouped together, and you can see it throws it right in the middle. So what use is that? We actually want a fit line for our subgroups for each category. So when I hit this button, first SPSS does the wrong thing, and it gives me not the right kind of fit line. So you can see it did a low S fit line. We want a linear fit line. Okay, I'm gonna click apply. And then it makes it nice and linear there. So that's the same. This is a regression line, linear line, linear line. So that's what we're wanting. So if SPSS says that, just you have to change it over here. You can click it. These are the properties. So now we have 3 fit lines. 1 for the entire sample, 1 for our extroverts up here, and 1 for our introverts over there. All right, so let's go to Stata and see how we would do that. So here's Stata over here, and I've opened up this data set there, and then we have our do file. Okay, so here's some, it's a little more complicated for Stata because you have to kind of specify everything in Stata, but it's going to be that graph 2-way again, but this time we're just going to do multiple fit lines. So let's start here. Dependent is stir craziness. Independent is things in isolation. And it's going to be if extrovert equals 0. So this is going to be the plot for our extroverts. This is the scatter plot for our extroverts, the dots for our extroverts. And then I'm just going to actually copy all of this over. The second parentheses is the fit line for the extroverts. Here is the scatter plot for our introverts. Oops, I did that wrong, didn't I? The introverts are 0, the extroverts are 1. But just know that you need to basically have both a scatter plot for your 0 group and a fit line for your 0 group, a scatter plot for your 1 group, and a fit line for your 1 group. And then it can be helpful. This is the legend. This is optional, but if you don't have this in here, you're not going to know who's who. So let me just run this without that part so you can see that Stata doesn't automatically put anything on there. If you run this. There you go. Oops, I did something wrong. I think I have an extra parentheses. All right, let's try that again. How'd you like that, Stata? There we go. All right, so now what you see here is 2 lines. So this is very much like the plot we saw for SPSS, but Stata doesn't really tell you who's who, so that's where that legend syntax comes in. So I'll let you play around with that later, but this is just in general how you do the fitted scatter plot or the group scatter plot in Stata. You just specify a scatter plot if your dummy variable is 0 and if your dummy variable equals 1. So let's go back to our slides. Okay, so like in mediation, there are 2 ways to do moderation. There are a couple options that you have here. The traditional way, and with all the options, is going to be much more complicated, and of course there's a lot more steps, but there are reasons that people have done it, which I'll let Hayes go into. I'm really going to show you the shortcut because we're doing our sort of, slice down class a little bit here. But note that all of these steps are in the steps in data analysis handout, so that you'll be able to go back to them if you want to go through the entire way. But I'm really going to focus on the simpler way of doing moderation. If we were going to do it the long way, the traditional way, we talk about centering. We would actually compute our interaction terms ourselves, run the regression as a hierarchical regression, and then we could do the probing. But what we're going to do is kind of go briefly over centering and the hierarchical regressions, and then I'll show you the easy ways to do it, which is to use process and the Stata shortcut. Okay, so why might people center? There's a whole chapter in Hayes that really goes into this idea that if you center, a lot of people really say that when you're doing moderation, you should always center, right? And people have different ideas about that. Centering in itself does not really change the significance of the variables. What centering does is it makes your intercept more interpretable. It makes some things easier to understand if you wanted to really think about that intercept. And then it also fixes this problem that produces a high VIF. When we have been looking at our assumptions after a regression, remember how we look at the VIF to see if any variables are very highly correlated. Because of the way that your interaction term is computed, it is going to have a high VIF. It's just a fact of life. But that does not necessarily mean that there's a problem with your regression. So I've put this note in your steps and data analysis handout that when you're checking for regression assumptions for this moderation analysis, even though you get a high VIF, it's not necessarily mean that there's a problem. So, but if you don't want to see that high VIF, then you could center, and that would get rid of that. But in general, the easy way is just to not center, just to bring it back. Okay, then these are all the steps here. This is how you would center. You would just say x minus, that is weird. Okay, that should be center x equals x minus whatever the mean of your variable is there. You would compute your interaction terms, which is really just your independent variable time multiplied by your moderator. And you could run that regression, and then you could probe it. And when we probe, we are choosing where to probe it. I'll talk about that once we get to that step. A hierarchical regression, we've seen this in some of our examples. It's really where you just run 2 regressions and you compare the differences, right? So let me do this in Stata for you. So let me show you what a hierarchical regression would look like. Actually, this syntax is wrong here. So let's say stir craziness on days in isolation. And then we're going to add in extrovert. What happens when we run this is that we get two blocks, right? So these are both just two regressions. One regression is if we just had days in isolation predicting stir craziness. The second regression when we add extrovert on days in isolation. So as you can see here, it's just two regressions, right? The difference in running it hierarchically is that we get this change in R squared. And that allows us to say how much more variance is explained with our new variables compared to our first set of variables. So that's the benefit of doing a hierarchical regression. You get that change in R squared, you can compare, is this a better model to that model? With this change in R squared, what you can see, R squared goes up from 0.3881 to 0.8404, right? And that's a change of 0.45. So we're explaining 45% more variance. Wait, no, that's not quite right. 45 points more variance, percentage points more variance just by adding that one variable extroversion into this. So yeah, so this is a better model of predicting stir craziness when we have extrovert in there. So that's the benefit of having a hierarchical regression. In your moderation context, having the hierarchical regression is going to help you to know whether your interaction terms are adding more variance. And so it just collectively, are they explaining anything? Is it worth having those interaction terms in there? And when you do the problem set, I'll give you an example that shows that. Okay, so those are the sort of long ways of doing the sort of traditional way of doing a moderation analysis. A lot of steps that I'm not going to go into detail on or have you practice. Instead, we are going to do the short version, and that is the next video.